In the sweltering heat of a New Orleans summer in 2013, the city buzzed with its usual mix of vibrant culture, music, and mystery. Beneath the lively exterior of this historic city, a darker story was beginning to unfold, one rooted in betrayal and forbidden desire. Sarah Reynolds, a 35-year-old woman, was the picture of Southern elegance. With her auburn hair often swept back in a neat chignon and her graceful demeanor, she was admired by many in her social circle. She was married to Jack Reynolds, a successful businessman who had built his wealth in the oil industry. Jack, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 40s, was known for his work ethic and commitment to his family. But despite the outward appearances of their marriage, the passion that once ignited their relationship had long since cooled. Enter Tom Harris, Jack's best friend since childhood. Tom was everything Jack was not: adventurous, carefree, and always up for a good time. In his late 30s, Tom had never married, choosing instead to live a life of freedom, running a successful bar in the French Quarter. He was a frequent visitor at the Reynolds home, often joining Jack for drinks or dinner. Over time, his friendship with Sarah deepened, evolving into something more dangerous. It started innocently enough. Small talk at dinner parties, stolen glances across the room, casual touches that lingered just a bit too long. Sarah found herself drawn to Tom in ways she hadn't felt in years. His carefree spirit, his charm, the way he made her laugh, it was intoxicating. Tom, too, felt the pull. He had always admired Sarah, but as he spent more time with her, admiration turned into desire. Their affair began in the most cliché of places, a dimly lit hotel room on the outskirts of the city. It was the first of many encounters. Each meeting was a whirlwind of passion, guilt, and the thrill of getting caught. They would meet in secret, in places where they were unlikely to be recognized. A secluded park, the back room of Tom's bar after hours, even in the dark corners of a jazz club where the music drowned out their whispers. As their relationship deepened, they became more reckless. The fear of discovery that had initially kept them cautious began to fade, replaced by a sense of invincibility. They would steal away together in broad daylight, exchanging knowing smiles as they passed each other at social gatherings, their secret hidden in plain sight. But as much as they tried to keep their affair hidden, cracks were beginning to show. Sarah's demeanor changed. She became more distant from Jack, her mind often preoccupied with thoughts of Tom. She would make excuses to leave the house, claiming she needed to run errands or meet with friends. But Jack, ever the observant businessman, began to notice the inconsistencies in her stories. The spark in her eyes that once shone for him was now gone, replaced by a coldness that he couldn't quite understand. Tom, too, was feeling the pressure. The guilt of betraying his best friend weighed heavily on him, but his desire for Sarah was too strong to resist. He found himself taking risks he would have never taken before, slipping away from his bar during peak hours, ignoring the curious looks from his employees as he hurried out the door. The affair consumed him, clouding his judgment and leading him down a path he knew could only end in disaster. By late summer 2013, the humidity in New Orleans hung thick in the air, and with it, a growing sense of unease settled over Jack Reynolds. For years, Jack had placed unwavering trust in two people: his wife, Sarah, and his childhood best friend, Tom Harris. They had been constants in his life, pillars of loyalty, but now something felt off. It began as little things, barely noticeable at first. Sarah, once so attentive, had grown distant. Their once intimate conversations had been replaced by silence, and the easy laughter they used to share was now a rare occurrence. Sarah started leaving the house more frequently, offering vague reasons. She had errands to run, appointments to keep, or friends to meet. Jack, not the overly suspicious type, dismissed it at first. After all, Sarah had always been independent, and he respected her space. But now these excuses came more often, sometimes late into the evening. Tom's behavior, too, had changed. For years, he'd been like a brother to Jack. They had grown up together, shared their triumphs and failures, and supported each other through thick and thin. But lately, Tom seemed different. He was jumpy around Jack, more reserved than usual, and Jack noticed an odd tension whenever the three of them were in the same room. There were awkward silences, moments where Tom avoided eye contact, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something unspoken lay between them. The signs were there, though Jack tried to ignore them. He noticed how Sarah's phone never left her side anymore, how she would tilt it away from him whenever a message popped up. There were whispers on phone calls that abruptly ended when Jack entered the room, sudden absences with no clear explanations, and a noticeable coldness in their once warm relationship. Sarah no longer looked him in the eyes the way she used to, and when she did, Jack could see something. Guilt, fear, or perhaps both, lurking just beneath the surface. Jack's mind raced, but he fought against the growing suspicion gnawing at him. He didn't want to believe that Sarah, the woman he had loved and trusted for so long, could betray him. Nor did he want to believe that Tom, the friend who had always stood by his side, could be part of such a betrayal. Jack told himself he was imagining things, that he was being paranoid, but the small clues continued to pile up, weighing on him like bricks. The turning point came one evening in late August. Sarah had left the house once again, this time claiming she needed to meet a friend for dinner. Jack, already uneasy, decided to stay home and distract himself with work. But as he sat in his home office, his mind kept wandering back to the growing distance between him and Sarah. It was then that he noticed Sarah's phone, left on the kitchen counter, vibrating with a new message. Jack wasn't the type to snoop, but something inside him, a nagging voice that refused to be silenced, urged him to check the phone. His hands shook as he picked it up, the screen glowing with the latest text message. What he saw confirmed every fear he had been pushing away. The message was from Tom, and it wasn't just any message. It was intimate, filled with the kind of words only lovers exchanged. Jack's world stopped. His mind went blank, consumed by a rush of disbelief and fury. He felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. His wife, the woman he had devoted his life to, and his best friend, the person he had trusted more than anyone, were betraying him in the worst possible way. Anger coursed through Jack's veins, but alongside the rage came a flood of sorrow and disbelief. He sat in silence for what felt like hours, staring at the phone, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what he had just discovered. How long had this been going on? How had he missed the signs? Jack knew that confronting Sarah immediately would lead to more lies, more excuses. He needed the full truth. He needed to see it with his own eyes. Fueled by a mixture of heartbreak and determination, Jack made up his mind. He would not confront them now. Not yet. Instead, he would set a plan in motion to catch them in the act, to leave no room for doubt. The affair would no longer remain unseen, and Jack would be there to expose it. With cold resolve, Jack began planning his next move, determined to reveal the full extent of Sarah and Tom's betrayal. Late October in New Orleans brought with it a sense of foreboding as a fierce storm rolled in, the sky heavy with dark clouds and the streets slick with rain. Jack Reynolds sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He had followed Sarah from their home, his heart pounding with a mix of rage, betrayal, and desperation. Tonight, he would uncover the full extent of her infidelity, the secret that had been gnawing at him for months. As he tailed Sarah through the rain-soaked streets, Jack's mind raced. He had discovered the affair weeks ago, but tonight was different. Tonight he had to confront them, Sarah and Tom, his best friend. He had planned it all out, but now, as the moment approached, the cold, calculated resolve he had maintained began to waver, replaced by a growing sense of dread. The storm raged on as Sarah pulled into the parking lot of a small, secluded hotel on the outskirts of the city. Jack parked a few spaces away, his car hidden in the shadows. He watched through the rain-streaked windshield as Sarah hurried inside, her coat pulled tight against the wind. Moments later, Tom arrived, his car pulling up beside Sarah's. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he watched them embrace briefly before entering the hotel together. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, his pulse echoing in his ears as he waited, gathering the last remnants of his courage. The thought of what lay ahead filled him with both fury and a sickening sense of inevitability. He couldn't back down now. He had to see it through. Jack stepped out of his car, the cold rain immediately soaking through his clothes. He hardly noticed. His focus was on the hotel, on the room where he knew Sarah and Tom were meeting. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, anger, betrayal, pain. But at the core there was a terrifying calmness, a determination that pushed him forward. He entered the hotel, the lobby eerily quiet except for the distant rumble of thunder. Jack knew the room number. He had heard Sarah mention it on a phone call she thought he hadn't overheard. Room 214. He moved down the hallway, each step heavy with the weight of what he was about to do. When he reached the door, Jack paused for a moment, his hand hovering over the doorknob. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath shallow and quick. He could hear voices inside, muffled by the walls but unmistakable. Sarah and Tom. The rage that had been simmering within him boiled over, and before he could think, he kicked the door open. The door slammed against the wall with a loud bang, and the room's occupants jumped in shock. Sarah and Tom were there, caught in the act. They both froze, their faces draining of color as they saw Jack standing in the doorway, drenched and wild-eyed. "What the hell is this?" Jack's voice was a low, dangerous growl, barely controlled, as he took a step into the room. His eyes darted between Sarah and Tom, both of whom were too stunned to speak. "Jack, wait!" Sarah started, her voice trembling, but Jack cut her off, his rage finally breaking free. "Wait? For what? For you to finish betraying me?" Jack's voice rose, filled with a raw pain that made Sarah flinch. "How long, Sarah? How long have you been doing this behind my back?" Tom, usually so confident and composed, looked like a man caught in the headlights. He stammered, trying to find words that wouldn't come. "Jack, I'm sorry, Sorry?" Jack's laugh was bitter, filled with venom. "You're sorry? My best friend and my wife betraying me, and all you can say is that you're sorry?" The room crackled with tension, the storm outside mirroring the chaos inside. Sarah tried to step between the two men, her eyes pleading. "Jack, please, let's talk about this." But Jack was beyond reasoning. The sight of them together, the fear in Sarah's eyes, the guilt on Tom's face, it was too much. Something inside Jack snapped, a dark primal fury taking over. In a blind rage, he grabbed the nearest object, a heavy brass lamp from the bedside table. "Talk?" Jack's voice was filled with a terrifying calmness. "I'm done talking." Before either Sarah or Tom could react, Jack swung the lamp with all his strength. It connected with Tom's head with a sickening thud. Tom crumpled to the floor, blood pouring from the wound. Sarah screamed, rushing to Tom's side, but Jack was beyond reason. "Jack, stop!" Sarah's voice was shrill with panic, but Jack, blinded by fury and betrayal, turned on her as well. The betrayal, the months of lies, the destruction of his trust. It all surged through him, pushing him past the point of no return. The scene descended into chaos. Sarah tried to fend off Jack's assault, but he was unstoppable, his rage fueling each blow. The lamp, slick with blood, struck again and again until the room was silent, save for the storm raging outside. When Jack finally stopped, his chest heaving with exertion, he stood over the bodies of Sarah and Tom, their lifeless forms lying in a pool of blood. Reality crashed down on Jack with the force of a tidal wave. He looked down at what he had done, the horror of his actions hitting him all at once. The rage that had driven him was gone, replaced by a cold, empty numbness. The storm outside continued to roar, but inside, Jack's world had come to a dead stop. The blood-soaked lamp slipped from his grasp, hitting the floor with a dull thud. Jack stumbled back, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. He had killed them, his wife and his best friend, driven by the unbearable weight of betrayal and anger. Now all that was left was a chilling silence and the irreversible consequences of his actions. Jack Reynolds stood in the blood-soaked hotel room, his chest heaving as he stared down at the lifeless bodies of his wife, Sarah, and his former best friend, Tom. The reality of what he had done hit him with the force of a sledgehammer. His hands, still trembling from the violent outburst, were stained with their blood. The storm outside continued to rage, the wind howling through the cracks in the window, but inside the room, everything was unnervingly silent. Jack's mind raced as he struggled to comprehend the gravity of his actions. He felt a rising panic, a suffocating fear that threatened to overwhelm him. He had never imagined himself capable of such violence, yet here he was, standing over the bodies of the two people who had betrayed him. The consequences of his rage were irreversible. There was no going back. For a moment, Jack considered turning himself in. He envisioned himself walking into the nearest police station, confessing everything and accepting the punishment he deserved. But as the thought formed, a cold, calculating part of his mind took over. If he went to the police now, his life would be over. He would lose everything: his freedom, his reputation, the life he had built. Panic set in as he realized that he couldn't face that reality. He had to find a way out, a way to cover up his crime. Jack quickly surveyed the room, his mind shifting into survival mode. He needed to make it look like he wasn't involved, that Tom had been the one responsible for the carnage. The idea of staging the scene as a murder-suicide began to take shape in his mind. It was a desperate plan, but it was his only chance. With a growing sense of urgency, Jack set to work. He grabbed the bloodied lamp, now slick with the evidence of his crime, and carefully wiped his fingerprints off the surface. He then placed the lamp in Tom's lifeless hand, arranging the scene to make it appear as though Tom had bludgeoned Sarah to death in a jealous rage before turning the weapon on himself. Jack's hands shook as he manipulated Tom's body, placing it in a position that suggested a struggle had occurred. But he forced himself to remain focused. Next, Jack searched the room for any personal items that might link him to the scene. He found Sarah's phone on the bedside table, the screen still lit from a missed call. Without hesitation, he wiped it clean of fingerprints and placed it next to her body. He scanned the room one last time, ensuring that nothing was left behind that could connect him to the crime. Jack's heart pounded as he finished staging the scene. He knew that the story he was crafting would need to be airtight. Any inconsistencies could lead the police back to him. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. There was still so much to do, and he couldn't afford any mistakes. Satisfied that he had done all he could to frame Tom, Jack slipped out of the room, careful not to be seen. The hotel was quiet, the storm outside masking any sounds of his departure. He moved quickly through the dimly lit hallways, avoiding the gaze of any security cameras, and exited the building unnoticed. His car was parked a few blocks away, out of sight from the hotel's entrance. He hurried through the rain, his clothes soaked and clinging to his skin, but he barely noticed. His only focus was on getting away, on putting as much distance between himself and the crime scene as possible. Once inside his car, Jack took a moment to collect himself. He looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. A man drenched, bloodied, and broken. The reality of what he had done was beginning to sink in, but there was no time to dwell on it. He needed to get home, to clean up, and to prepare his alibi. Jack drove through the storm, his mind racing with thoughts of what he needed to do next. When he arrived home, he immediately went to the bathroom and stripped off his blood-soaked clothes, throwing them into a garbage bag. He scrubbed his hands and face, the water in the sink turning red as he washed away the evidence of his crime. But no matter how hard he scrubbed, he couldn't rid himself of the guilt that clung to him like a second skin. After cleaning himself up, Jack moved to the next part of his plan. He needed an alibi, something that would place him far from the hotel at the time of the murders. He checked his phone, thinking of any calls or messages he could use to establish a timeline. He crafted a story in his mind, rehearsing it over and over until he was confident it would hold up under scrutiny. But as the night wore on, the weight of what he had done began to bear down on him. The adrenaline that had fueled him earlier was wearing off, leaving behind a crushing guilt that gnawed at his conscience. He couldn't escape the images of Sarah and Tom lying dead on the hotel floor, the blood pooling around them, the result of his uncontrollable rage. Despite his efforts to cover his tracks, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. The guilt was consuming him, gnawing away at his sanity. He tried to distract himself, to push the thoughts away, but they kept coming back, relentless and unforgiving. Jack knew that the coming days would be the true test. He would have to maintain his composure, to act as though nothing was amiss, even as the investigation began. He would have to play the role of the grieving husband, the shocked friend, while inside, he was falling apart. He had set the stage for Tom to take the blame, but deep down, Jack knew that the truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how well it was buried. And when it did, there would be no escaping the consequences of his actions. The next morning, the tranquility of the Hotel Sainte Marie was shattered when a housekeeper, making her rounds, discovered the gruesome scene in room 214. Sarah Reynolds and Tom Harris lay dead, their bodies cold and lifeless. Blood had soaked the pristine white sheets, and the room, now a crime scene, reeked of death. The housekeeper, horrified by what she had stumbled upon, quickly called hotel security, who then contacted the New Orleans Police Department. Detective Maria Alvarez, a 15-year veteran of the force known for her meticulous approach and sharp intuition, was assigned to the case. Alvarez was in her early 40s, with a reputation for solving complex cases that others might overlook. Her sharp, dark eyes and no-nonsense demeanor often intimidated those she questioned, but her dedication to finding the truth was undeniable. When Alvarez arrived at the hotel, she immediately took in the details of the crime scene. The bodies of Sarah and Tom were positioned in a way that suggested a struggle, but something felt off. The weapon, a heavy lamp, was still clutched in Tom's hand, and the scene had been staged to look like a murder-suicide. However, the forensic evidence quickly raised red flags. The angle of the wounds, the blood spatter patterns, and the way Tom's body was positioned all pointed to the possibility of a third party being involved. Alvarez began by securing the crime scene, instructing the forensic team to gather every possible piece of evidence. She watched closely as they dusted for fingerprints, collected hair fibers, and took detailed photographs of the room. The initial examination revealed inconsistencies that couldn't be ignored. For one, the lack of defensive wounds on Tom suggested he hadn't fought back, which didn't align with the apparent struggle. Additionally, the lamp, though wiped clean of fingerprints, had smudges in areas that suggested someone else had handled it before it was placed in Tom's hand. As the investigation progressed, Alvarez started interviewing the hotel staff. She discovered that the couple had checked in separately, with Sarah arriving first. The concierge recalled that Sarah seemed nervous, frequently glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone. Tom had arrived later, and while their interaction was brief, it was clear they were familiar with each other. The hotel's security footage showed Jack Reynolds entering the hotel hours later, a detail that would prove critical. Alvarez then turned her attention to Jack Reynolds. She had already been informed of his relationship with both victims, and her instincts told her that Jack might hold the key to understanding what had truly happened. When she interviewed him at his home, Jack appeared shaken, but Alvarez detected something more, a carefully controlled demeanor that didn't sit right with her. Jack recounted his version of events, stating that he had been home all night, unaware of the tragedy that had occurred. He expressed shock and sadness over the deaths of his wife and best friend, but Alvarez noticed the subtle contradictions in his statements. He mentioned details about the crime scene that hadn't been released to the public, a red flag that Alvarez couldn't ignore. She pressed him on his whereabouts, asking for specific times and alibis. Jack provided a detailed account, but as Alvarez cross-checked his story, discrepancies began to emerge. Alvarez also spoke with friends and family members, slowly piecing together the truth about Sarah and Tom's affair. She learned that the couple had been meeting in secret for months, their relationship intensifying as time went on. Jack, known to be fiercely protective of his reputation and marriage, had been blindsided by the betrayal. Several of their acquaintances mentioned that Jack had recently been more withdrawn, and his temper, usually well-controlled, had flared on a few occasions. As the evidence against Jack began to mount, Alvarez revisited the crime scene, going over every detail with fresh eyes. The forensic team confirmed that the fingerprints on the lamp didn't match Tom's, further supporting the theory that the scene had been staged. The security footage from the hotel revealed Jack's presence, and though it was circumstantial, it was enough to cast doubt on his alibi. Alvarez's investigation revealed a web of lies, deceit, and hidden animosities. Jack's carefully constructed alibi began to crumble as more inconsistencies were uncovered. The guilt that Jack had tried to bury was now bubbling to the surface, and Alvarez knew she was closing in on the truth. In the final stages of her investigation, Alvarez reviewed the timeline of events leading up to the murders. She meticulously reconstructed the sequence, identifying the moments when Jack's alibi failed to hold up. The evidence was clear. Jack had discovered the affair and, in a fit of rage, had killed both Sarah and Tom. He had then tried to cover his tracks, but the truth was there, hidden in the details. As Alvarez prepared to confront Jack with the evidence, she knew that the case would hinge on her ability to get him to confess. She was ready to use every tool at her disposal, from psychological pressure to the overwhelming weight of the forensic evidence. The walls were closing in on Jack Reynolds, and Detective Maria Alvarez was determined to bring him to justice. As the investigation reached its critical stage in mid-November 2013, Detective Maria Alvarez knew that the case against Jack Reynolds was nearly airtight. Over the past weeks, she had meticulously gathered every piece of evidence, every witness statement, and every detail that could tie Jack to the brutal murders of his wife, Sarah Reynolds, and his best friend, Tom Harris. Now, it was time to confront Jack and unravel the truth. Jack had managed to maintain a veneer of innocence, but Alvarez was well aware that beneath that exterior lay a man tormented by guilt and fear. The pressure was mounting, and Alvarez could see the cracks beginning to show. Jack's carefully rehearsed story was falling apart as the forensic evidence continued to contradict his claims. On the morning of November 14th, 2013, Alvarez decided to bring Jack in for questioning one final time. She had spent the previous night going over the case files, cross-referencing the forensic reports with the timeline of events, and re-examining the psychological profile that had been developed on Jack. Everything pointed to him as the perpetrator. The time for subtlety had passed. It was now time to apply the pressure. Jack arrived at the precinct, his expression a mix of defiance and desperation. Alvarez met him in the interrogation room, where the atmosphere was tense, the air thick with unspoken truths. Jack's eyes darted around the room as he sat down, a faint sheen of sweat on his forehead. He knew why he was there, and so did Alvarez. She began the interrogation by presenting the forensic evidence. The fingerprints on the lamp, the blood spatter analysis, the inconsistent positioning of the bodies, all of it pointed to a staged crime scene. Alvarez laid out the facts with clinical precision, each piece of evidence chipping away at Jack's defenses. She could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes as he realized that his attempts to cover up the crime were unraveling before him. Next, Alvarez brought up the witness statements. Several people had seen Jack at the hotel on the night of the murders, directly contradicting his alibi. She quoted the exact times, the descriptions of his movements, and the interactions he had with hotel staff. Each statement was a nail in the coffin of his story. Jack's face paled as the weight of the evidence bore down on him. Finally, Alvarez turned to the psychological profile. She spoke about the stress Jack had been under, the feelings of betrayal and anger that had been festering inside him since discovering the affair between his wife and best friend. The profile painted a picture of a man pushed to the brink, consumed by rage and a need for retribution. Alvarez watched as Jack's composure began to crumble, the facade he had maintained for so long finally giving way to the truth. Jack's breathing grew heavier, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edge of the table. Alvarez could see that he was on the verge of breaking. She leaned in, her voice firm but not unkind, and said, "Jack, we know what happened. The evidence is clear. You can't keep running from this. It's time to tell the truth." For a moment, the room was silent, the tension palpable. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Jack began to speak. At first, his words were halting, as if he was struggling to force them out. But soon they came in a flood of emotion. He confessed to everything: the discovery of the affair, the rage that had consumed him, the blind fury that had led him to kill Sarah and Tom, and the desperate, futile attempt to stage the scene as a murder-suicide. Tears streamed down Jack's face as he recounted the events of that fateful night. He spoke of the love he had once felt for Sarah, the betrayal that had shattered his world, and the unbearable guilt that had haunted him every day since the murders. By the time he finished, Jack was a broken man, his confession a stark admission of the horrors he had committed. With the confession in hand, Alvarez moved swiftly to ensure that justice would be served. Jack was formally charged with double homicide, and the case quickly moved to trial. The evidence, combined with Jack's confession, made the outcome inevitable. The trial was a somber affair, the courtroom filled with the palpable weight of tragedy. The prosecution laid out the case with precision, while Jack's defense could do little but plead for leniency based on his emotional state at the time of the murders. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with a guilty verdict. Jack Reynolds was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that reflected the severity of his crimes and the impact they had on the lives of those involved. In the final days of 2013, Jack found himself alone in a small, cold prison cell, left with nothing but his thoughts and the memories of what he had done. The weight of his actions bore down on him like a crushing burden, the images of Sarah and Tom's lifeless bodies replaying in his mind over and over again. Jack had once been a successful businessman, a husband, and a friend, but now he was nothing more than a prisoner, shackled not just by the bars of his cell, but by the overwhelming guilt and regret that would haunt him for the rest of his life.